Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are very pleased to welcome former Director of the National Economic Council, Gary Cohn, and former Senator Heidi Heitkamp today for a bipartisan conversation on the future of Social Security. I will say this is going to be a slightly different event than our normal ones. We do not have a moderator, as you can note. So these guys are going to have a lively conversation, largely on Social Security, perhaps on some other topics, and then they're going to throw it open to you for Q&A, so I hope you're ready. When we promised to order Chipotle for everyone, there were slightly fewer people signed up, but perhaps that mandatory spending for a growing population was the perfect object lesson for today's discussion. I do want to briefly mention a couple of upcoming events before we close for the quarter. On Tuesday, December 3rd, Maurice Cox, Chicago's new Commissioner of Planning and Development, will be on a panel to discuss his work in Detroit, where he held a similar position and led the city's urban revitalization efforts, and to talk about the lessons he learned there and what he's prioritizing for our city. We've also announced a new project on the intersection of music and politics called the Jukebox Ballot. If you're a student and want to tell us about a song that shaped your political or civic outlook or reflects it, or one that you associate with a political event in your life, add it to our playlist. We'll be compiling a list of 25 songs that reflect the political zeitgeist of you Chicago students. Check out jukeboxballot.com for more. And always go to our website at politics.uchicago.edu to learn about all of our upcoming events. We will, as I mentioned, have lots of questions. The mic will be over here in this aisle. We reserve priority for the first 3 questions to go to students. We ask you to please make sure that your phones are on silent and let you know that the bathrooms are downstairs if you need them. And now here to formally introduce our speakers is Nikita Despande. Nikita is a second-year medical student from Greenville, South Carolina. This fall, she has been an IOP Fellows Ambassador to Heather McGee, and she's been a frequent attendee at our events. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Hello and welcome. So as we all know, we're here today to talk about the sustainability of Social Security. And though this room may have many diverse perspectives, I think perhaps we all may share the desire that we and our loved ones can have access to a life with dignity as we enter older adulthood. But we have to manage this desire with the knowledge that Social Security spending is occurring at a rate that is faster than revenue generation can match long term. So thankfully today, to discuss how we can maximize the well-being of older adults and our community at large and federal fiscal responsibility, we are lucky to have former U.S. Senator Heidi Heitkamp and former U.S. Director of the National Economic Council, Gary Cohn. Yes. So before serving on the U.S. Senate, Senator Heitkamp served North Dakota as tax commissioner and attorney general, and then went on to serve in the Senate from 2013 to 2019. She, while there as the first female senator representing the state, sat on the subcommittee on regulatory affairs and federal management. And now she's gone on to launch the One Country Project, which seeks to reconnect the Democratic Party with rural ideas and rural voters. We also welcome Mr. Gary Cohn, who held numerous leadership positions at the Goldman Sachs Group before serving as president and chief operating officer from 2006 to 2016. He went on to serve the Trump administration as advisor to the president on economic affairs and director of the National Economic Council. And together they taught a seminar at Harvard's IOP on the real state of the union. So please join me in welcoming Senator Heidi Heitkamp and Gary Cohn.
Well, I'm going to do the introductory stuff and let Gary do the heavy lifting, which he always claims he does anyway. And I'll fix any mistakes that he makes. So don't get too overly anxious when he's talking.
Welcome to my life.
Yeah. You know, when I was thinking about this and introducing it, we could tell you kind of the history of how we ended up in kind of paired together at the IOP and the work that we did together in Washington, D.C. But Social Security is a really big issue, and it's an important illustration of the problems that we have right now in Washington, D.C. And so I think it's a great way to introduce kind of the challenges of decision-making, of fact-based decision-making in Washington. And when I was thinking about it, I was thinking about, what's the average age of an undergraduate here at the University of Chicago? It's probably 20, 21, right? So in 30 years, it's going to be 2050 or thereabout. And so when you're halfway through your life, which we're going to assume that your life expectancy is about 100 years, you undergraduate students, what's the world going to look like? And so I thought, well, I'm going to Google it and ask a simple question of what will the world be like in 2050? And it was enlightening because the futurists are way overly optimistic, in my opinion. So let me tell you what their predictions are. Better medicine and medical care more evenly distributed worldwide. That's probably likely, given disruptive technologies that are being used in medicine. A carbon-free energy world. Universal worldwide literacy. Very few people anymore in the country or in the world who won't be able to read and write. More gender equality, one of my favorites. Less global conflict, elimination of poverty globally, universal translators, and those of you like me who are Star Trek freaks, you know what that is. That's that little thing you wear on your lapel that's going to make you be able to speak. Amazing artificial intelligence, universal access to the internet, and you go through this whole list. And I want you to think about where it is that you want to be in 2050. And when you look at these predictions, you may say they're unrealistic, but many, many of them follow a trend line that you can track over the last 100, 150 years in terms of literacy, in terms of healthcare, in terms of life expectancy. And so many of them are not that unrealistic. But the one thing that we know from the work that we've done, whether it's in the private sector, whether it's in the public sector, nothing happens without planning. Nothing happens without a vision. Nothing happens without the hard work of actually implementing the ideas. And so I want to tell you, I used to say used to use the old adage, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride. If we think any of these things will happen without serious engagement from serious people, it's not going to happen. And so I wanted to kind of start this discussion on Social Security with just some of the challenges, some of the statistical challenges. So the United States population is growing at just 0.62% last year. And we're now seeing population growth at an 80-year low. Our population is aging rapidly as we baby boomers enter the twilight of our life. By 2030, 1 in 5 Americans will be 65 or older. And by 2035, there will be more senior citizens in this country than there are children. That's the first time in the history of this country that that's true. Many people would tell you, and Gary and I argue about this quite a bit, the old age dependency ratio, which I think is highly relevant here. When you look at 2018, there are 2.4 retirees. By that I mean, there are 24 retirees for every individual 65 or over, meaning we're now at retirement at 65, for every 100 working age people. And working age for this purpose is 15 to 65. That is up from just 19 out of 100 in 2010. And it will sharply increase in the next 2 decades. Over a third retirees per working people. So that's a real challenge because Social Security has always been pay it forward, right? We use the money that's being deposited to pay out the benefits that we're receiving with the idea that that is perpetual. And as we see more and more recipients and fewer people paying into the system, that will challenge our whole retirement system. This is just one piece, as we talk about it, of retirement security. America ranks dead last among developed nations in the gap between what citizens save for retirement and what they actually need. Think about that. Many Americans have no savings at all. And even if they have a pension, those pensions are being threatened by the challenge of pension reform. So this is all against a backdrop of a milestone that we had this year. We crossed the threshold of $23 trillion worth of debt. That just happened, what, about 3 days ago, Gary, as we watch it. So you say, big deal. If you're somebody who believes in modern monetary theory, there's no one on this podium who does. We think you got to actually eventually pay your bills. But remember this, as the president, and I will tell you, there's a lot of people who predicted Donald Trump couldn't be president because of some things that happened during the campaign. The moment that I thought he would not become president was when he went on Squawk Box one morning and said he was the king of debt, and that if he became president, he would write down debt. Let me tell you, on every financial statement, in every organization and every country of the world, American debt is carried at full value. The minute you start talking about discounting debt or letting the debt limit go, any bean counter will tell you you have to discount that amount. Trillions of dollars of balance sheet assets would be diminished. And that never got the attention that it should have gotten. But 40% of all the debt that we hold in this country is held by foreign nationals. And so when we're talking about whether debt is a problem, this is an incredibly important backdrop. And no one seems to care as much about debt as we did when we did our thing at the IOP at Harvard. But it will challenge our Social Security system in ways both in terms of the lack of savings on individuals, putting more stress on the Social Security system to be that one thing that will keep elderly out of poverty. But it also makes it very difficult to figure out how we're going to pay for Social Security when we are now at that point, that tipping point, where more money is going out of the system than coming in. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gary, and then we'll answer any questions that you have.
Great. Thanks, Heidi. I'm sorry I can't see you guys over there. You can take the podium away if you want. But let me just back up 1 second before I get into the sort of Social Security specifics and talk a little bit about what Heidi and I did when we were at Harvard, because I think it's an interesting topic. So we taught this IOP study group on what we called the real state of the union. And every week we came in and talked about a specific topic. I'm sort of framing where we want the questions, by the way. I'm framing where I want the questions. You can ask her anything, by the way. So any tough ones she's answering, the easy ones I'll take. So we literally dissected topics week by week. And the topics were, we went through tax and tax reform, one of my favorites, infrastructure, rural versus urban, healthcare, immigration, entitlements, trade and tariffs, and debt and deficit. And literally went through each of them fact-based. We allowed anyone in the room to say anything as long as they had a legitimate fact-based source, and that's not Fox or CNN. Those are not legitimate fact-based sources, just even though you work for one of those. We sort of looked at that and said, we're happy to talk about these. And the key to what we tried to do in each of those sessions is we not only presented the problem, we tried to really work towards an amicable, bipartisan solution. And I think that's important, which led us ultimately to this idea on Social Security. Could we take a group of, it ended up being sort of 16 to 30-year-olds, because we actually had a high school group, 16 to 30-year-olds, pose to them the problem of Social Security and say, come up with a real solution for a real problem that you think is A, mathematically correct. And we had 2 applied mathematicians on our team who's checked your math, so you couldn't lie to us on the numbers, because numbers don't lie. Well, unless you're in Washington, numbers lie a lot. But B, could it be practically implemented? Like, was there potentially political wherewithal to get something done? And we held this competition, which I think you're talking about doing here potentially at the University of Chicago on solving one of the other big social problems. And we ended up with about 20 proposals, and I would say that literally 15 of them were really legitimate. 5 of them, I think they were just coming for the free Chipotle. And so we ended up digesting those 20 proposals down into one basic winner. And I thought what I would do is talk to you about the winner, because I thought they literally probably hit 95% of the issues in what's going on in Social Security. So this all came out of that the Social Security Trust Fund puts out an annual report on solvency. They're required by law every year to talk about the solvency of the trust fund. The trust fund by itself is fictitious. Your money does not go into a trust fund. It goes into the general ledger of the United States. And in fact, whenever the Treasury talks about using emergency measures to keep the government open or extraordinary measures, they're just stealing what little money there is in the trust fund to use it for general obligations. So no one should think this money sits there and is segregated. And what they basically, in the last report, which is the 2018 report, they basically said that based on current present values, demographics, life expectancies, all the assumptions they take, which are fairly accurate. We probably would change the assumptions. If this group were doing it, you would come up with better assumptions. But for government work, they're not bad. They basically said that by 2034, which is 15 years away, that the trust fund would be what they call insolvent. Now, insolvency in government terms doesn't mean it goes away. It just means that basically we are not in a position, I shouldn't say we have nothing to do with it, they are not in a position to pay out 100% of the benefits that they should pay out. So what it would mean is in 2034, based on current collections, if the government didn't step in to pay the benefits, which I firmly believe they would, because they would just deficit finance it, they would have to reduce benefits to 79% of what you're supposed to get. So everyone would end up with an automatic 21% haircut, and that number would just keep going down year after year after year. You would get less of the benefit you're supposed to get. No one thinks that's the answer that would happen. Everyone thinks that the government would just deficit finance this, and then it would go on. The funding gap, just to put this in perspective, on the 75-year actuarial table they use, and they use 75 years because somehow they still think life expectancy is 75 years, even though it's not, but they haven't changed that assumption yet, is $13.2 trillion. So they said basically, if you put another $13.2 trillion, you would get rid of that funding gap in 2034, and you'd be able to say you're solvent for the next 75 years. So that's basically government acknowledging where we are today. And so we said, that's your starting point in the hackathon, in this competition. We want you to solve for that. Now, there's some pretty basic ways to solve for this. This is not that difficult of an equation. You either cut benefits, you either cut benefits or you raise revenue, or you start playing with ages. So all those things are on the table. I'm going to actually go through what the winning team came up with because we thought it was the best combination of all the above. When I get to point number 6, I'm going to take some liberties and change what they did because we didn't totally agree with point number 6, but one of the requirements of winning the competition was not only was it mathematically sound, it had to be politically sound. And I think point number 6 makes it politically sound. So the first point that they came up with was that they wanted to cut, and let me back up. Let me start and explain how Social Security tax is collected because that's a really important premise. Today, Social Security tax is collected. Basically, you as an individual out of your paycheck, you pay 6.2% of your paycheck. Your employer pays 6.2%, 12.4 combined. If you're self-employed, 6.2. So this is for the vast, and I could keep saying vast, majority of taxpayers in America, their largest single payment to the US federal government. In fact, 50% or more of US citizens, this is beyond the vast majority of what they pay. In fact, most of them pay no federal income tax, but they still pay the 6.2% Social Security tax. And the premise, I'll give you the premise, I'll defend the good and the bad. The premise was when Social Security was created in the 1930s, is this shouldn't be a handout. You should pay in to receive, so we don't want to give anyone a handout. So the first point that they made is that they said that, like, right now you pay in the 6.2% on your first $139,200. That's a number that's indexed to inflation, so it goes up every year. It's been going up year after year. They suggested that we should remove the cap. So remove the cap, so on any earned income you have, you should pay in a Social Security, tax. But as an incentive for doing that and making this very politically appealing, we would lower the tax rate from 6.2% to 4.7%. So it's 150 basis points of tax reduction. That, interestingly, this will be a really interesting stat, gives 96% of the people in America an actual tax cut. So 96% of people in America don't get to the 130.
The employer portion is not reduced.
Exactly. So $132,900, 96% of the people in America don't get that. Now remember, if it's a couple, it's $139,200 each side. So it's not joint. So you're now giving 96% of the population a tax cut, and you're now making the wealthier side of the equation pay in more money, but at a lower rate. That in itself raises these are all 75-year numbers. We're just gonna keep it that way. That in itself raises $2.3 trillion. We're getting on our way. We gotta solve for 13 plus. Okay. Next thing. The interesting thing about the plan is that it historically only included earned income. This is one of Heidi's great pet peeves in life. Earned income is basically salary, wages, commissions. It doesn't include capital gains, dividends, interest, or what Heidi would refer to as unearned income, or as people have been—
Rich people get richer income.
Yeah, or as people have been referring to all weekend as Mike Bloomberg entered the race, the money you make just for living. It doesn't refer to the money you make just for living. So the second point was that we should include all forms of income into the new 4.7% tax rate. That brings in brings in exactly $2.8 trillion over the plan. Number three, number one and number two, number one's probably not controversial at all, probably politically unbelievably easy to do. Number two, interesting. But when you talk about income inequality today, it goes right after. Number three, more on the income inequality thing. There are a lot of compensation incentive plans that big companies use to pay their employees some type of benefits that are outside of what you consider earned income. So it's a fringe benefit, employee-sponsored health plans, flexible spending plans, all those type of plans where your employee says, hey, you're gonna have out-of-pocket healthcare expenses during the year. We're gonna give you a flexible spending plan. We're not gonna tax that. We're gonna give that to you with pre-tax dollars. So we don't collect Social Security tax on that. We don't collect income tax on that. The suggestion was to count that as part of your income, which it probably should be. That's a really big one. That's $4.47 trillion. So just in changing income availability and actually lowering the rate, you bring in almost $9 trillion of money. Then you get to some things that are sort of more interesting over time. Number 4, the way Social Security works out right now is it's basically a payout curve. And if you're below certain income levels, you get 100% of the payment, and the payment decreases with your wealth effect. It's just putting a bigger bend in the payment curve. So literally people in the top brackets only get a 10% payout, and I could go through the payout curve. Brings in about $4.2 trillion in that area. And then number 5 is the age. So when Social Security started in 1935, we had life expectancy of 61, and we had the ability to collect Social Security at age 60. So it was really designed that you pay in for 40 years of your working life, and you take out for 1 year. It was actually a huge windfall for the US government when they created Social Security. It was a way to tax you and bring in money for the federal government. Obviously, as people have lived longer and longer and continue to live longer and longer, that equation has changed dramatically. So the last idea here is to create a ratio, and I could go through the ratio, but it's basically your retirement age, working age, not let that get more than 20 years, cap that at 20 years. But in 2022, and there's a reason to start in 2022, but I won't get there. In 2022, start moving out the age, and you have to move it 1 month every 2 years. So you move it a year every 24 years. So we all shake our head and say, yeah, that doesn't really matter. Like I'm the victim, by the way, in this, because the last time we changed Social Security payout was people born in 1960 and beyond. I was born in 1960, so I missed the earlier payout. Poor me, I can't get it until I'm 67. You should all feel bad for me. I can't get Social Security at 67. If I was born a few weeks earlier, I would have got it.
Gary keeps asking rich people, how many of you are going to take your, we were at a program, how many are going to take your Social Security? They all raise their hand. And he kind of looks at him like, why?
Why? Why would you take it? So those things together, which Heidi and I felt that none of those things were that drastic. They actually more than fix Social Security. They deal with one of the major issues going on right now in the world today, which is income inequality. They actually stop taxing and try to redistribute, because we know the government is horrible on redistribution. For those of you who are government majors, you'll know this, that the multiplier effect on a government spent dollar is like 2, the multiplier effect on a personally spent dollar is like 10. So we're trying to put more money back into the less well-off people and take more money from the wealthier people. This does all that. All those things together raise $16.2 trillion. We only need to solve for 13.2. So we have extra money. So if you really want to be politically correct and you really want to make this so you can pass it, the last thing you could do that would really sizzle, because you've already given 96% of the people a tax cut, is why don't you give retirees a bigger payout? So we would then re-index, because every year the cap on what you pay in and the payouts get re-indexed to CPI. We would re-index payouts to something called CPIE, which is the elderly index, which takes into account, I wouldn't say it's perfect, it's more representational on what an elderly person would pay in. It has a bigger healthcare component, it has a bigger components on things like that. We would increase the payouts based on CPIE, which would cost us $1.2 trillion. So when we net get done with all of those things, we've raised $15 trillion against a need of $13.2 trillion. We actually have a surplus of $1.8 trillion, which gives us room to sort of adjust any of the other factors in the equation. And when you think about this, what really appealed to us is it attacks a lot of the issues that we're all talking about today versus income inequality. But more importantly, to me, politically, if I stood up in front of the room and said, look, I can fix Social Security, I can get 96% of the people in the country a tax cut, and I can get the elderly a bigger payout, it sounds like it's pretty appealing. So I'm not a politician. I've never run for office. She's run for office much more successfully than probably anyone else in this room. And it appealed to us, and so we decided that we would go along with this proposal and thought that it solved a lot of issues and really makes it sustainable because we're making some changes in here that are very fluid that we don't have to ever go back, like the change of indexing the life expectancy. So if people end up living to 150, we're going to deal with that. You know, if you live to 150, you're not going to get Social Security till 130. But so you're going to pay in a lot more years. So that's really where we ended up in trying to deal with this. We have taken this proposal, we've taken it to Washington, we've taken it to the Ways and Means Committee, we've talked to everyone there, we've taken it to the White House, we've taken it everywhere we can take it. Everyone sort of loves the proposal, but in technology terms, now that I'm a tech investor, I find there's a new term, NIH, which is called not invented here. It's really hard to sell a proposal that's not invented here. So, you know, there's a lot of different proposals circulating Congress these days that have little aspects of what we have, not a lot of aspects, but little aspects. And so we're going to try and continue to push this forward and see what we can do on the proposal.
The leading proposal right now is a proposal by Congressman Larson, who is the chair of the committee, the subcommittee on Ways and Means. He has a rate of 7.2. That's a non-starter in Washington. The beauty of this proposal is we actually reduce the rate. But by applying it to a bigger base, we produce more income. Bigger base being eliminating the cap.
God, that sounds really familiar.
Yeah.
Tax policy
Don't
101.
even go there, Gary.
Okay.
Because if we start debating your tax bill, we'll be here all day. But the point that I want to make is that there's also a number of proposals about investment. And I think they had a little provision about, you know, kind of where can we get a higher rate of return. There's some creative ideas on what we could do with an infrastructure bank to actually lower a cost for infrastructure, but also increase the Social Security fund. There's a lot of things that you can do that would be incredibly creative that would achieve, I think, some pretty remarkable goals. But the piece here that I think is obviously the toughest is not eliminating the cap. I think everybody accepts that you're going to eliminate the cap. The question is, what do you do with unearned income, or what I call unearned income? How does that apply? That's an important linchpin of this proposal. And so, you know, we think that at the end of the day, Washington, D.C. fails in one critical space, which is look up. What's on the horizon? And that's why I gave you the statistic of the number of people who have saved nothing for retirement. Think about the stimulative value of what we're talking about by putting more money into the economy, the thing Gary was talking about 10 times. Think about kind of how important it is to tackle this today. We have a pension fund called Central States that is literally going to go broke, impoverishing people who worked so hard all their life, who now have increased medical conditions, but yet we can't seem to fix that pension problem. So we've got a retirement crisis that's looming in this country. This is a huge part of what we need to do to provide a base of responsibility for a secure retirement and then build on that base. So I think we'd be interested in any kind of reaction to what you heard here or any other questions. So I don't know if the students, we take 3 students first, so.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My name is Indy and I'm a second year in the college. So I wanted to just sort of generally hear some of your thoughts about the idea of spousal benefits and how it's been argued that like some women receiving Social Security who, for a variety of factors, might not be working for as long as their spouses are like receiving fewer benefits, and I guess like how you see that playing into the system of Social Security and how it could be made more sort of like gender equitable.
Oh.
I said, you're doing take the tough questions.
I think that when you look at kind of historically, people would say the family is the earning asset, or the earning unit. And women typically, their work was at home, raising kids. That transition began in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And now we have, my husband's, who's a family physician, was chagrined because this will be the first year since he was a medical student and I was a lawyer that I actually make more money than he does. So the point that I would make is that that's a transition point that takes care of itself as we see income inequality regarding wage gaps narrowed. So my argument would be, let's not mess around with the Social Security system. Let's try and fix the wage inequality problem that we have. And certainly women who, my mother-in-law, for instance, only collected her husband's Social Security. My mother worked her entire life, but her Social Security was based on her husband's earning. And so in some ways, the system is self-corrective because you take the highest wage earner in the event of the death of a spouse. That's not true if you're both drawing Social Security, but I think into the future, you're going to see this not be a gender problem. It may just be an income inequality or an earning inequality problem within families.
Thank you.
So that's not something we considered. And I think, like I said, you look at over time, the ARC would probably say that we need to fix that problem in some other place.
So I'll add, as Heidi pointed out, in the ultimate proposal that won, I left it out because it's more controversial. There was a diversified Social Security trust fund portfolio into high returning assets, which brought in another $5.2 trillion. Now, it's a funny one because there really is no trust fund to diversify, but everyone thinks there is. But the reason they had done that was exactly for the issue. So we didn't deal with medical issues and we didn't deal with spousal. But so when the winning team actually won, they brought in 18 point something trillion dollars to deal with the issue because they knew those were the other issues. They brought in 22.2 trillion of the 13.2 because they wanted to be able to do dependency support, increase the medical support, and increase the other things. This is my personal opinion. I think when you're talking about diversifying and buying assets, you could blow up a perfectly good proposal. I think the 5 points I sort of proposed, I think are politically marketable, right, left, center. I think when you're talking about investing, it gets ugly. And it's just a reason to not do anything.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Angela. I'm a fourth year in the college, and thank you both so much for being here. My question is, Social Security is obviously very complicated. What's the number one thing you think American voters misunderstand about Social Security?
That there's a trust fund.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's
You remember Al Gore talked about the lockbox, and that was a bit, that's never been true. Mm-hmm. It's always been a payout as you go. There is actually, this is the first year, right, Gary, if you consider interest, that we actually paid out more than the theoretical amount coming in. So the American public isn't wrong that there is a solvency problem. It's not as emergent as I think people think it is, but I think the big fallacy is that there's this big pot of money that the government raids as opposed to kind of the consistency in the system overall.
Same answer, just different version, is that people think because they paid in, they're guaranteed to get out. There's no legal contract that says just because I paid in that FICA line for 40 years of work that the government's obligated to give it back to me in Social Security. You never signed that agreement. They never signed it for you.
There is no politician in the world who would ever let those words come out of their mouth.
By the way, I completely agree. I started saying you will get paid your Social Security, but in order to pay it, this is the largest expense in the U.S. government. This makes everything else look clean.
And when you look at debt and deficit, and so you say, what's going to blow it up? Because we don't just look at discretionary, non-discretionary, general fund spending. We look at the whole bundle. Social Security is so much more fixable than Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare and Medicaid is going to be what transfers huge amounts of debt from me to you. And that's a whole nother area, way too complicated for a hackathon, because it gets us involved in end-of-life decision-making. It gets us involved in what's happening with healthcare costs rising over inflation overall. So,
Just to put it in perspective, I just reached down for this paper just to give you the actual number. In 2008, I guess it's 2019 of the federal revenue collected, Social Security will be 35% of all dollars collected by the federal government. That's 35% of 3.3 trillion. So it's well over, it's like $1.2 trillion a year is what comes in. And as Heidi said, this is the first year that there is more of the 1.2 trillion coming in. There's more than 1.2 trillion going out, and that's why we're running out of money.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Leah Sofer, and I'm doing a master's in public policy at the Harris School. And it was really interesting to hear from you guys about kind of the lack of saving in our country, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on the feasibility and effectiveness of bringing back the postal banking system.
Look, I'm adamantly against it, not just because I was a banker growing up, but I just don't think we want another government agency involved in the banking system. Now, look, there's a huge underbanked problem in the United States. I'll be the first to tell you that we've got to solve the underbanked problem in the United States, and the fact that we've got a large swath of the low-income earners paying away, 20% interest rates on credit cards and going to payday lenders to get their checks cashed and giving up 10% of their income to get cash out of the system is completely wrong. So I'm the first one to admit this is a huge problem, but involving another quasi-federal or federal agency into the system is probably not the solution to me. I haven't really seen postal banks work that well. Probably the only place it works quasi-well is Japan, but it's really a savings bank. It's not a commercial bank. They use the Japanese postal bank as it's the largest pension fund savings bank in the world, but it's the total savings economy. I think that what we have to do is we have to find ways for the commercial banking system to allow, or we have to mandate that every individual in this country gets a bank account. And I do think, and I'm probably talking my own book right now, I do think that the digital economy and the digital wallet and the digital banking space can solve this and will solve it. Our regulators in the United States are going to be slow to adapt. Unfortunately, if you look at the unregulated markets, I'm not looking for an unregulated market, you have now banked the unbanked because they can all have digital bank accounts. We're going to have to find a way in the United States to make a highly regulated digital bank account where the cost of the bank account is zero, so everyone can have a bank account. So if you are a low wage earner in the United States or an hourly wage earner, you can get paid into your digital bank account, get your money out and use that to pay, and you have zero friction. We can do away with the friction costs, which probably means you have more than 10% more disposable income because you're not losing that in the friction.
The problem is not infrastructure for saving, it's lack of income, right? So when 40% of the people in this country consistently say they couldn't afford a $400 hit to their budget, it doesn't matter if they're bankable or not bankable. What matters is that they don't have the wherewithal to actually put money away for savings. I spent a lot of time when I was Attorney General working on payday lending and trying to fight payday lending because, again, friction costs for poor people is so much higher. Well, so how do you tackle that? You try and get people into a system where they actually can begin to save, even if it's just a couple dollars a month. And a couple of the proposals that are moving through Congress has an idea that I had with Senator Booker and I think Young and I forget who the other, it might have been Tim Scott. But it has what I called the Christmas fund. When I was a kid, What every bank, little local community bank did is they had a Christmas fund, and they would just take a couple dollars out of your account every month, and that was supposed to be for Christmas or your Christmas presents, but it was an easy mechanism for savings, because what we see is very low income earners actually take money out of their 401k, pay the penalties, because they don't see that $1,000 that they're saving actually resulting in a better life, and they're paying 20, 30% in payday lending. So they make a good economic choice to take that money out of savings. We need to figure out how we can mandate savings both into 401ks, which is make it an opt-out as opposed to an opt-in system. We need to create an employer-based mechanism for savings for low dollar impacts that can reduce that friction cost. But one of the the cart before the horse problems is we all talk about infrastructure when the fundamental problem is income inequality and the inability of people to meet current expenses. Not because they're frivolous or inappropriate, they just don't make enough money to make a living.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Judy Weiss. I'm a community member and a Social Security taker now. And I was paying both the employee and the employer
Good for you,
portions
Judy.
for 40 years. Before I ask my two short questions, I just want to say I'm so pleased to hear you talking about lifting the cap as non-controversial. I was a member of the Gray Panthers for 40 years. I mean, seriously, you don't have to be old to. They're now, the organization doesn't exist as such anymore, but they have been fighting for that for ages. I mean, decades, and it was always controversial. So I'm not sure when that changed, but I'm very glad to hear it. Okay, so two questions. One is, I am concerned that you see raising the age as a solution. I understand that you're doing it very incrementally. It's only going to be a year after 24 years. But that still, to me, is kind of short term. If it's 24 years and it's 48 years, and it's going to happen. And the people that affects the most are the people who can least afford it. That is low-wage workers who have really hard jobs that they cannot keep doing past the age of, say, 50 or so. I'm thinking of hotel workers. I'm thinking of cleaners. I'm thinking of people who are on their feet every day for decades and decades and decades. And that's going to affect them. Even if it doesn't affect this generation of them, it will affect future generations. So I'm sorry to hear that. I'd like to hear your justification of that. And the other question is, what I didn't hear in here, and maybe it was in one of the points you left out, was encouraging immigration. Because as you know, immigrants tend to be younger, and they tend to have younger children. I know you're saying that's politically infeasible right now, but that's, as we know, a self-fulfilling prophecy. That kind of argument is really not a long-term acceptable argument if you're thinking long-term. So,
I want to take
I
want to take the immigration piece, because I, like you, thought that's got to be a huge part of this. And when Gary and I started on this, what we did is we met with the big brains who had studied Social Security at Harvard, at Boston College, at MIT. We actually sat down, and I raised that with every person who had done enormous studies that immigration would add to this. They universally said I was on the wrong track.
why?
And
It's actually a negative today, believe it or not.
Why?
I'll explain to you why.
Yeah, I would tell you that so that's why we didn't pursue it here, because we were told.
So here's the dirty little secret. The dirty little secret on immigration is we've got a lot of illegal immigrants in this country that buy Social Security numbers to get through E-Verify, that pay in and never take out.
Yeah. So there,
So
this idea
it's
that
actually bigger. So Heidi and I agreed with you. We started down this path, and literally all the PhDs have written all the work on this, said don't go there, because if those people become legal, you're going to end up paying them all out. We sort of still disagree with this fundamentally.
Yeah.
We're just giving you the academic research that to work today as a migrant worker, to work today as a worker, it's a staggering amount of people that pay into Social Security and don't take out.
So where I would agree with you is if we expanded legal immigration,
Yep.
people came in and actually added to the workforce. And this is something that we talked about a lot in banking with the Fed, because we look at productivity. And what's actually going to drive GDP is productivity increase. Productivity increase historically has been new entrants into the workforce. Right now, we have virtual zero unemployment, if you look at just the transition points, but yet we are not growing the economy. That's because we are not growing the workforce. And so we could make an argument that GDP growth would happen as a result of increasing legal immigration. It's just not politically where we are today. And on the age thing, I agree with you. I think that it's troubling because I, as a lawyer, Gary, as a banker, as long as we have our wits about us, which some people would disagree with, we can work forever, pretty much. My dad, who was a construction worker, worked road construction. My mom, who was a school cook, could not work forever. And so it goes back to, do we bifurcate the workforce? And that's a really tough issue. But as we look at transitions in workforce, we're going to see less and less heavy manual labor driving the workforce, and more AI-driven, different kinds of jobs in the workforce that will look more like banking and lawyer jobs than look like assembly line factory jobs.
Look, I don't want to be callous on this one, but it's just unrealistic that you can keep a static retirement age and life expectancy go on. Like I said, I was part of the binary year. So 1960, we jumped 5 years. It was a binary jump. If you were born on December 31st, 1959, 62, full retirement. You were born January 1, you missed it by an hour, you're 67. Okay, so we did it. And by the way, 59 years later, I don't quite remember that event. I'm sorry, but it's hard to remember that event. When we're talking about moving a year every 24 years, I get the hardship, but you're talking about actuarial data. And if life expectancy goes to 120 and you're starting to collect at 67, you just can't it's just a mathematical equation. Maybe someone in this room is smarter to solve that equation. It's no different than your life insurance, by the way, disappears. Most policies disappear at 100. So remember to die at 99.
Yeah. Well,
if you want your life insurance.
The system was never calibrated
Right.
for a third of your life being Social Security eligible. It was never calibrated.
It was calibrated for 1 year. It was literally calibrated for 1 year.
And we can recalibrate, but that would require a whole lot more revenue than what we're talking about here.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. I'm Dave Ennis, a 47th year alumnus, and I wanted to make the point or ask a question about, and I think your solution for Social Security I think is fantastic. Did you consider, or could you consider, the problem of state and local pension plans that are outside the Social Security system and the huge problem that is nationally?
We are not going to fix Illinois' problem, no.
We're not federalizing Illinois, sorry.
No, I mean, and it goes back to what I said about pension problems. I mean, we have let people be overly optimistic about the revenue, and and overly optimistic about how soon people are going to die, and we have a pension crisis. At some point, we have to solve it. If you take central states and the challenge that we have there, which is the UPS, Teamster problem that we have right now, we have been fighting to try and fix this problem against an incredibly a sympathy. I could bring in all my guys who are crippled, who've had 2 knee replacements, because back in the day they carried 70 pounds, which they aren't allowed to do today, and they are looking at 10, 15, 20, up to almost 50% cuts in their pension, and they're more worried about their family than themselves. That we've got to do pension reform. Now, the state and local stuff is really tricky, because a lot of, if you're Texas and you say, we took care of our problem, you take care of yours. And there isn't a national kind of motivation that cuts across states to try and solve that problem.
And remember, Social Security, even in its best of forms today, is going to allow to live you at or below the poverty level. It's not the end-all, be-all retirement
keep you out of
mechanism. It's part of what hopefully would have been a more robust retirement mechanism.
So-
and we're trying to fix that sort of baseline piece.
So you look at the three legs traditionally of retirement. It is defined benefit, which have all but in these pension funds gone away. It is you own your house and you have equity in your house, so your housing costs are either lower or you take that equity out of your house. And it's Social Security. We have fewer young people investing in homes, less equity in homes, less savings into retirement account, and we're going to become more dependent on Social Security. And so this retirement problem is a much bigger issue than just Social Security, but we're just trying to figure out this piece of it as kind of an entryway of talking about retirement, especially when you're looking at a third or a fourth of all the people in the next 20 years being over the age of 65.
Good afternoon. I'm Miles Zaremski. My background is healthcare law and policy, and I've been doing that for about 46 years and been brought to Washington to advise your colleagues at one time. My question is a much simpler one than what you all have been talking about, and that's the linkage between Social Security and healthcare. I'm an advocate of healthcare being a right for every American, as many millions of others probably are. But when we hear on the campaign trail, from universal health care, Medicare for all, to the public option and anything in between, I would like your respective views on the issues that you've raised with Social Security and funding it into the future, and the costs that will be involved to expand the Affordable Care Act if it stays in place after the Fifth Circuit rules, and the cost for health care and the linkage of the two, because it seems like that's an unenviable position to be in.
Doctor's wife.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that I would say, and it's like, for me, I get like angry almost when people talk about how we're going to pay for health care, because we don't talk about what we're paying for, right? We never talk about how are we going to reduce costs. I had a friend, Richie Carmona, who was the Surgeon General for a number of years. He and I ran together in 12, and we spent a lot of time together. And he used to say 70% of all healthcare costs are related to chronic disease, most of which is preventable. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start talking about what should be our healthcare policy. And what I tell people our policy should be keeping people healthy longer. And so how do we do that? When I was the Attorney General, I helped negotiate the tobacco settlement. We have the lowest rate of smoking globally. Only 14% of adults in this country smoke. Now, that hasn't solved all of our problems, but we have to start addressing, rather than saying, we're just going to keep paying for what we're paying for today, we have to start addressing what we're paying for and how do we reduce those costs and take costs out of the system. And so the one reason why I'm not a big fan of Medicare for All is that I think that it eliminates the marketplace of ideas that have created disruptors. What do I mean by that? My son, back when he was foolish and didn't get health insurance, sprained his ankle playing softball. Okay, so he could go to the emergency room, but in Minneapolis, they have an imaging center where he went, paid cash, and for $50 was told that his ankle wasn't broken. It was just a bad sprain. If he had gone to the emergency room, that cost would have been $1,000. So we've got to start looking at what we're spending money on, and we've got to create an incentive to lower health care costs overall. Now, that's not to say that we don't have an emerging problem. Alzheimer's is going to be $1 trillion a year debt problem for us if we don't solve it. So we've got to invest in neurological research that is going to reduce the usage of oldest. So you take a look and you say, we know the dramatic increase in healthcare costs once you hit 65, right? 60, 65. So my idea is, let's not fight the Medicare for all. Let's bring 60-year-olds into the Medicare system, lowering the risk pool. You get them in better managed care. They come into the system not being as sick when they're 65 because they've had access to greater health care when they're 60. You've lowered the risk pool or reduced the risk pool for younger people sitting here because now they're not paying for the health care of the sicker group. There's a whole lot of strategies that we can pursue nationally that can make a big difference that won't take the big chunk out of it. But like I said, if you want to look at debt and deficit, the big looming monster is healthcare costs. It's not the stuff we've been talking about today, and we're not going to solve that by moving the chess pieces around the who pays board. We're only going to solve it by actually addressing reduction of healthcare costs per individual in this country. And we have to do it by telling people in this country, which is why politicians don't do it, you have to change the way you're living because we're not going to pay for behaviors that lead to a higher rate of healthcare usage. And we know that if we address mental health, we could reduce overall healthcare costs because the relationship between noncompliance and diabetes and mental health is almost unbreakable. We know we can do better in helping raise healthier children who aren't going to have as many chronic diseases, whether that is behavior and mental health issues or whether that is asthma. You name all the chronic conditions somebody's going to have later on in life. And so healthcare policy in this country, we spend way too much time talking about how we're going to pay for it and not any time talking about what we're buying.
Look, is this Gary concur?
Look, I agree with Heidi on this one. The one thing I'm a bit of a fact junkie. Remember, we have the highest healthcare costs in the world with the median outcome. How can it be that we have the highest healthcare costs with median outcomes? I mean, look, we know the answer. We do no preventative care in this country. We wait till your death. The vast majority of people in this country don't go get a blood pressure test, don't go get a urine sample, don't go get simple blood work that will catch 90% of things. They wait till they have the heart attack, they wait till they have the diabetes. Then miraculously we have to cure it. We have this thing turned upside down, and is Heidi's right. All we ever argue about is who's going to pay for it, not what are we paying for.
The postal question. We talked about banks and post offices. We talked about what my husband calls the Jiffy Lube of healthcare, which is there's 5 tests, preventative, screening tests that you can do that actually matter, and you should be able to drive into the drive-through and get those tests done. You shouldn't have to make an appointment. That's all part of your preventive health strategy.
And by the way, we'll take questions off of Social Security if anyone's interested. I mean, we'll talk about Social Security until we're blue in the face, but we like to fight about tax policy too.
Gary, your 6 points make too much common sense. So what can we do out as private citizens to help you get your point across, for you to?
Yeah, look, you're better off to ask Heidi in some respects because she's been a legislator. We have to we just have to keep talking about it. These things, as you know, they just don't happen overnight. Our legislative system is designed to slow everything down and take as long as possible and try every bad answer before we get to the right answer. I think someone very famous said that. So we're in the process of trying all the bad answers, and hopefully we can get to good answers. It's not from a lack of trying. We've gone to see everyone we can see. We'll continue to talk to people, but this is hard. These are moving, embedded things, and you'll see. I mean, we got a reaction over here, which is a natural reaction. Even if you want to move the eligibility, 1 year every 24 years, it's, oh my God, you can't do that. That by the way, that is the most controversial thing in the list I said. Yeah. That is, there'll be this pushback on capital gains and interest and dividends. But you know what? I think what's going on right now in the political climate is actually quite helpful to us, because this idea of taxing capital gains and taxing interest and taxing unearned income, it's it's in the light of day. Whether you know we're talking about it or not, we're talking about it. As we're talking about income inequality, we're definitely talking about it. So I'm moderately encouraged that a bunch of the topics that have to be raised to get to the right point are starting to be raised. And we're just going to have to keep gnawing away at it. To me, these are just exercises in perseverance.
Yeah. One of the reasons why we did the project that we did at Harvard is we see these, what I call the lookup issues, that aren't getting addressed because we're too busy arguing about stuff that when we look back on it in 5, 10 years, we'll wonder why did we spend all the time arguing about that when we have a retirement security problem, when we have a debt and deficit problem, when we have an infrastructure problem, when we have a globalization problem or a workforce development problem. And so what we hope to do by doing the stuff that we've been doing is build a constituency among the public for demanding solutions to long-term issues and problems. I have an expression that I give. I said, my generation will be the first generation that inherited from our parents and borrowed from our kids. And when you look at borrowing from our kids, what's interesting about it, and I will tell you this, who's going to pay? It's not only an intergenerational transfer of responsibility, it's an interracial transfer of responsibility. Because young people, the majority-minority is going to happen, and we are transferring as we, in my generation, spend the money and don't make long-term investments, and debt and deficit, infrastructure is just another way to pass on debt and deficit, right? If you don't take care of what you got. And so we're not only transferring to the younger generation, we're transferring racially from a dominant white majority group to a dominant majority group. So think about the equities of that. And so we've got to build constituency among the baby boomers to take responsibility for the problems that we have in this country and put us on a long-term trajectory for solving those problems and quit worrying about today's.
We're going to take these last two questions and we're going to be out of town. Okay.
I'm going to take you at your suggestion and shift it a little bit, but can you tell us a little bit about the demographics or the profile of the group that proposed this, and what might we learn from who they are, what fields of study, age? Was there anything about the study group that presented this proposal?
They were very diverse.
What, the group that proposed this plan?
They were one woman.
Really diverse.
But minority.
Yeah.
Majority minority.
Extremely diverse.
There's one.
Yeah. We had Abdul Hakim, Roy Liu, a lot of them, yeah, very Zhang Youyin. I mean, literally, they were all over the place.
I think one was the...
I will admit one flaw to our hackathon, okay? I'm going to confess. Every one of the winning team, they all had worked at Goldman Sachs or McKinsey.
Sorry.
So, but they had gotten themselves together. So we needed to do, we actually had a high school team. That's why I said it went from 16 to 30. Our high school team was a top 5, top 6. They just didn't have the mathematical, you need to be an applied mathematician to solve this problem. They just didn't have the math skills. Conceptually, they were really good. With this team here, and I could show you the team. I mean, we got them here. I don't know if there's an American on this. Yeah, there's one American there. Yeah. There's one American, two Americans.
No,
Strickland. But they were all graduate students.
First generation immigrants.
Yeah, first generation immigrants, all grad students, all had worked in consulting or banking. They had unbelievable mathematic skills. What separated them is they had unbelievable research skills, unbelievable mathematics skills. But that said, we had 4 or 5 groups at the end that it was really close. Like the other clever idea. There was a really clever idea. This is like the win-win idea. And so one of the groups proposed, and this was almost mostly females in this group, they said, take the Social Security Trust Fund, buy all the student loans in America, pay and lower the interest rate, so you're helping the youth of America making making their debt for college much cheaper, but it's the most secure security in the world, which it is, because student debt is unexcusable in bankruptcy or anything. So you've got basically a AAA asset, lower the interest rate down to like 2% from what it is now, because you're guaranteed to get that back, and now you're increasing the return from 0 to 2%, and you're lowering the cost of education. Like, that was a great idea. We didn't know how to politically get it done because there really is no fund to do that. So there were some unbelievably creative ideas. There was a lot of people that wanted to do a land use tax. Land use tax was hot. So a national real estate tax. Everyone wanted to do a national real estate tax. There were some people that wanted to do a VAT tax. So a lot of people came about it, like, just figure out ways to create revenue. And we didn't think just creating revenue was a politically amicable solution. We thought, giving 96% of people a tax cut, paying out more to the retirees, and basically raising money in the middle, and then cutting the payments to the wealthier people, raising the age over if I raise it 3 years over someone's life, like I said, I got raised 5 years. I thought it was fine. So we digested a lot of information. You're really feeling bad for me.
No, I don't.
Okay.
By the way, I was born in '58, so I beat you.
Thank you. See, it's unfair.
I'll take one more.
Hi, I'm Gilad, third year in the college, and I first want to thank you both for this very informative discussion. So you mentioned that you enjoy talking about tax policy, and I was curious if you guys could both lay out your best argument and the worst argument that you have for your own tax policies that you guys both support.
You get to go first.
Okay.
You got to defend that thing.
So here I'm going for this because I'm going to give you some numbers, not because I'm being rude. So look, basic tax policy, and this is what we were saying before. Look, this is my view on tax policy. My basic view on tax policy is broaden the base, lower the rate. I think that should be basic tax policy for anything. And anyone who talks about a flat tax, that's exactly what you're doing. You're just saying, look, take every dollar you earn, and we're going to tax it. Forget deductions, forget everything. So my basic argument for the tax policy that we implemented was we tried to simplify it, we tried to broaden the base, and we tried to lower the rate on the personal side. And I think what people are missing, and it's shocking to me, and I would assume that a crowd here would get the mathematics of this, that when you broaden the base and lower the rate, that you're actually paying more taxes if you were someone in a high income bracket that was taking a lot of deductions. And I'm looking for something in particular because I have a favorite little thing here that I love showing you. So that's on the personal side. On the corporate side, and I'll talk about that while I'm looking. On the corporate side, it's relatively simple. We're in a global economy. We have to fight for jobs and corporate headquarters and tax domiciles. And I'll admit it, in my prior life, I had the greatest pitch ever. I could go into a board and a CEO and say, look, I have a way for you to increase your return to shareholders without doing a whole lot. You don't have to sell another product. You don't have to fire an employee. You don't have to do anything. They go, that's impossible. I go, no, it's really possible. You just re-domicile from New York to Ireland. You lower your taxes from 35% to 9%, and 100% goes to shareholders. And they go, well, what do we have to do? We have to move your corporate headquarters. You have to hold your board meetings over there, and that's all you have to do. And by the way, there's a couple big companies here in Chicago that did it. There's one big insurance company that did it for sure, and I could keep going through the list. And I said, that's not right. We should not be in a position where we're chasing companies out of this country. So look, I didn't need to go to 21%. I'll be the first to admit that that was a compromise between me and the president to go to 21%. I never would have gone to 21. I would have gone higher, but that's where it is. So here, I'm going to give you some interesting data. So every presidential candidate has published their tax returns. So you can do a lot of data mining on tax returns. We have a presidential candidate now running they are still in the race, who claims that the first thing they will do is repeal the Trump tax cuts. Okay, interesting. That would be a huge tax break for this candidate.
Yeah.
Okay, it will be. And the reason this candidate says that, I'm being gender not specific, as you can tell. This candidate says that because in 2017, the rate paid on taxable income, in 2017, they paid 34.6836%, and the rate they paid in 18 was 33.6556%, okay? So they paid about 1% less on taxable income. So they walk around saying, I got a tax cut. The problem is, and I'll save you, I'll cut right to the punchline. The problem is that in 2017, they got enormous amount of deductions. They got state and local tax deductions, they got real estate deductions. So to me, the number that matters, and I think that all you should look at, is take your taxes paid and look at that relative to your total income. So the number that you should look at is income to tax ratio. So in 2017, this person paid 28.951%, and in 2018, they paid 29.9. So they basically paid 1% more of their income in taxes. And now I'll give it away. On $2 million of income, that's $20,000.
Yeah.
So if this person repealed the Trump tax cuts, they would save themselves $20,000.
Yeah.
But she does say the first thing she will do, I already gave you her income, you know who it is. She says the first thing she will do is repeal the Trump tax cuts.
So taxes, the perversion that we have in taxes is trying to decide, is it to raise revenue or is it to incentivize behavior? And so the first thing you have to ask is, what's a legitimate tax expenditure? And that, we can talk about the SALT deduction. Is that legitimate? Is a R&D tax credit legitimate? So the first thing you have to do is understand the buckets of kind of logical thinking that goes with taxes. In the United States of America, the tax structure is not just revenue producing. It's incentive driving. And you may say, well, I hate that. Well, get rid of the production tax credit and you would never have had renewable energy development. So let's just agree that we're going to incentivize because it's easier than giving a direct grant to fund the behavior, reducing tax reductions. And as you look at that, as Gary says, what you've done is you've had to raise the rate to produce the revenue to subsidize the behavior. And so when you start talking about broadening the base and lowering the rate, it's basically saying we're going to get the tax structure out of the business of incentivization of whatever behaviors. So the one thing that I would say, and I'm going to go to the individual side, the individual side is skewed for wealthy people. And Gary just explained to you, how complicated that is. But I will tell you this. People in this country who go to work, put on their coveralls and shower at night, many of them pay a much higher rate than people who simply sit on their hind ends and collect their trust funds. Because we have decided as a society that under-earned income is going to be taxed at a lower rate, with the theory that it then becomes more investment. And the perversion on this is Ted Cruz's idea that he's going to index that capital gains. So that's not even the worst part about this. The worst part about this, and people will talk about the estate tax. I could care less about the estate tax. It's a tax for those people who think they're going to live forever, who do no estate planning, because there's plenty of ways of avoiding estate tax. The problem that we have is there is wealth that's created in this country that is never subject to tax. You know how that happens? It's called basis stepped up basis. So if my kids inherit my Apple shares, which I have at $1, right? Because I bought them in the 80s, they'll never pay taxes on it. I'll never pay taxes on it, but I've transferred an incredible amount of wealth to my kids. These incentives, and here's another little scam. A health savings account, okay? You say, how could that possibly be a tax scam? Well, if you're wealthy enough to put all the money that you want into a health savings account, we retire, we go on Medicare, we can spend that.
That was number 3. We're going to tax it. Social
I
Security
mean,
tax.
honest to God, there's all of these things that basically allow wealthy people to never experience tax on their income because we've incentivized behaviors. And the stepped-up basis is for helping businesses who you'd want to transfer. Why should you be able to basically, if you're, I mean, Elizabeth's like, well, we're going to stop all philanthropic giving. I mean, she didn't say it that way, but my point is, well, let people give as much as they want to give and take the deduction. They can only deduct their basis, right? Why should they be able to deduct the capital gains that they've never realized that's never been taxed? And how do you solve that problem? And so I think there's things that you can do, you know, rather than creating a whole new wealth tax infrastructure that hasn't worked in any other country in the world because of exactly what Gary's talking about. You create an incentive on the corporate side, you'll create an incentive on the individual side to seek tax shelters and go become a citizen of the Caymans. I don't know, whoever's going to give you the big deal, right? And so I think that the one thing that we have to do is we have to have better financial literacy of people on how taxes work. And then we have to start basically being honest with people about where the real loopholes are and how we ought to be able to fix them. Now, I will tell you that we can have a whole big discussion about whether corporate income tax is the right way. The disturbing part of what happened on that side of it for me is that they say, we need to be competitive. Well, if you go out and look and you consider subnational taxation with your federal taxation, the United States wasn't that far out of line. It just is that top-end rate, and I think it did drive investment out of the country. I'm not saying that, but I think we have to come up with a global tax system that works to avoid, to basically reduce avoidance at all levels, both international and national, and that's a much more difficult problem than you know, this simple tax fix would be.
I'm going to finish with a 30-second thought, and then we're going to thank you very much for being here. So I just think it's important that people know this. So if you look at 2016, 2017, 2018, I'm sure it will be true in 2019, the United States consecutively in those years has collected more tax revenue. No one would lead you to believe that. We have collected more revenue each year. It's true. I know you don't like it, Heidi. The corporate collection piece has gone down.
Yeah.
So the corporate, I'm telling you the truth.
Yeah,
the corporate correction piece in the high of the Obama years was about 9%, which was about $300 billion. I'm giving you the high. The low will probably be about 6%, which is $200 billion. Corporate taxes.
30% reduction.
Yeah, 30% reduction
that doesn't even count the
on
pass-throughs.
A number that is 6%.
Doesn't count the pass-throughs.
6% of total revenue collected. The Social Security number is 35%. But the individual side has gone up. Miraculously, the individual side has gone up, and more people aren't paying federal income tax in the United States than ever because of the EITC and the increase in child care credit, which must mean, mathematically, A equals B, B equals, okay. Which must mean that the wealthier taxpayers in the United States are paying more taxes. It's the only way, with corporate going down, the bottom 50% paying zero,
or less,
that we're collecting more money.
It could be zero or less because of the earned income tax credit.
Yeah, it is zero.
Yeah, no,
50% of Americans pay negative to no tax. Federal only. They pay Social Security. They never get out of Social Security. With that, are you done?
We're done.
Can I say
We're
thank
done.
you?
We're done.
Thank you very much for coming.